Adeline Foss was 42 years old when she buried the last of her family's savings along with her husband and found herself, within the same bitter month, turned out of the parsonage she had called home by the very church council her husband had served for 20 years. It was the Reverend Council of Millhaven, Colorado, led by a stern deacon named Harmon Pruitt, who declared that a widow with no ordained husband had no further claim to church housing. However faithfully, she had kept its books and its garden. With barely $22 to her name,
I have
Adeline used
$25 for the
17
Stone
of it to
Chapel.
buy,
Looking for
at
30.
public
Do I hear
auction,
30?
the
$30
derelict
to the
stone
lady in the
chapel
front.
on
Any
Widow's
advance on
Ridge that the whole
$30? Going
town
once,
had
going
abandoned a
twice.
decade before. A purchase everyone in
she can stay
Millhaven called
there.
the surest sign, yet that
Foolish
grief
girl,
had
it's
finally
haunted.
unmoored her reason. They did not know that inside its silent
Let
bell
there be light.
tower, sealed away since before the chapel's own congregation had scattered, waited an unfinished story that would restore not only Adeline's own fortunes, but something the whole town believed had been lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Foss. If you are watching this from a place the world has stopped listening to, tell us in the comments, because this story was written for you. Adeline had been born Adeline Marchetti in the summer of 1841, the daughter of an Italian stonemason named Vittorio Marchetti, who had come to the Colorado Territory to cut foundation blocks for the growing mining camps, and a schoolteacher mother named Ruth, who had followed her own father west a generation before and never turned back. From her father, Adeline learned the patient, exacting language of stone, how a block cut true would bear weight for a century, while a block cut in haste would crack the first hard winter it endured, and how a mason worth his trade never blamed the stone for a builder's impatience. From her mother, she learned letters and numbers both, taught at the small kitchen table by lamplight long after the day's chores were finished, and it was Ruth who instilled in her daughter a particular reverence for the written word, insisting that a story set down honestly, however humble its subject, outlived the person who wrote it and carried some piece of them forward long after they were gone. Adeline grew up watching her father raise the walls of half the buildings in the growing town of Millhaven, including, in the year she turned 9, the modest stone chapel on Widow's Ridge itself, built at her father's steady hand under the direction of a young circuit preacher named Elijah Thorne, a man Adeline remembered vividly from her childhood as gentle, restless, and endlessly hopeful about the future of the rough mining town he had chosen to serve. Vittorio Marchetti died when Adeline was 17, crushed beneath a collapsing foundation wall at a mining camp 2 valleys over, a death that taught Adeline, far too young, the particular grief of losing a person whose life's work had been built on making things last. And it was in the months following his death that she came to understand her father's old lessons about stone not merely as trade advice, but as something closer to a philosophy for living. That patience and honesty in the laying of a thing mattered more than how quickly it rose from the ground. Ruth Marchetti, widowed young herself and left to raise 2 younger sons on a schoolteacher's modest wage, leaned heavily in those years on her eldest daughter's steadiness, and Adeline took on, almost without noticing the transition, much of the household's practical burden, keeping her mother's small accounts, tutoring her brothers in their letters, and learning, in the process, precisely how much quiet strength was required of a woman left to hold a family together with insufficient means and an abundance of will. It was this same steadiness, cultivated across those difficult years, that would later serve her so well in the keeping of Nathaniel's church ledgers, and that would, decades further on, allow her to read an old preacher's unfinished journal with the same patient, unflinching attention her mother had once brought to a column of overdue tuition payments. She married at 20, in that very chapel, a serious and devoted young minister named Nathaniel Foss, who had come to Millhaven fresh from seminary to take up the pulpit after Elijah Thorne's sudden and much-lamented departure some years before, a departure the town spoke of only in hushed, uncertain terms even a decade later. Nathaniel was a careful, scholarly man, given to long hours of study and longer hours of quiet service to the sick and the grieving, and Adeline found in him a partner whose devotion to their small congregation matched her own inherited devotion to careful, honest work. She kept the parsonage, tended its garden, and, more than any official duty required of her, kept the church's financial ledgers with the same precision her mother had once brought to a lesson book. Since Nathaniel, brilliant as he was with scripture, had little patience for columns of figures and gladly surrendered that responsibility to his wife within the first year of their marriage. Over 20 years, Adeline came to know every family in Millhaven through those ledgers, every tithe given, and every hardship that occasionally excused one, and she came to understand, better than almost anyone else in town, exactly how the chapel's finances had ebbed and flowed since its founding, though there remained always one persistent gap in the records that puzzled her. A large founding subscription raised in the chapel's earliest days that seemed, according to the oldest surviving ledger pages, to have simply vanished from the books without explanation sometime around the year of Elijah Thorne's departure. Adeline and Nathaniel were never blessed with children, a sorrow they bore together quietly over the years, filling the absence instead with an unusually close devotion to the wider congregation, treating the children of Millhaven's families as something like their own. And it was this very closeness that made Nathaniel's sudden death, from a fever that swept through the town one difficult spring, so devastating to the whole congregation and not merely to Adeline herself. She had believed, in her grief, that the church she and Nathaniel had served so faithfully for 2 decades would honor that service by allowing her to remain in the parsonage as a respected elder of the community, tending the garden and the small library Nathaniel had built there, continuing the modest bookkeeping she alone still understood. She had not accounted for Harmon Pruitt, a prosperous dry goods merchant who had risen to deacon and effectively controlled the church council's decisions through the sheer weight of his financial contributions, a man whose public piety Adeline had never entirely trusted, though she had kept that private judgment to herself throughout Nathaniel's tenure out of simple deference to her husband's authority. In the days immediately following Nathaniel's burial, several of the older families of the congregation, people Adeline had comforted through their own losses over 20 years, brought over casseroles and quiet condolences, and for a brief, merciful week it seemed the church she had served so faithfully might extend to her the same steady grace she had always tried to offer others. That fragile comfort did not survive the arrival of the council's formal deliberations, for grief, Adeline would come to understand, occupies a very different place in a community's heart than the practical matter of who occupies a parsonage, and it did not take long for the warmth of casseroles to give way to the colder language of vacancies and necessities. Harmon Pruitt moved with a speed that startled even those in Millhaven accustomed to his brisk manner, calling a council meeting not 3 weeks after Nathaniel's funeral to discuss what he called the practical necessities of finding new ministerial leadership, necessities that, in his telling, required the parsonage vacated promptly to make room for whatever young preacher might soon be called to Millhaven's pulpit. Adeline attended that meeting herself, uninvited but unwilling to let her own future be decided entirely without her voice present, and reminded the council, with the same careful precision she brought to her ledgers, that she had served the chapel faithfully alongside her husband for 20 years and asked only for reasonable time to arrange other lodging before winter closed in fully. Pruitt's response, delivered with a smoothness that made the hair rise on the back of her neck, was that the church's charitable resources were, regrettably, quite limited, and that a widow without children or a husband's ordination held no formal claim on housing meant for an active minister's family, a position the rest of the council, cowed by Pruitt's financial influence over the congregation's affairs, declined to challenge. Adeline asked, pointedly, whether the council might instead draw upon the chapel's founding subscription fund, the very sum she had spent years puzzling over in the old ledgers, only to watch Pruitt's composed expression flicker, just slightly, before he informed her curtly that no such fund existed any longer, that it had been long since absorbed into general operating expenses decades before either of them had joined the congregation. Adeline did not believe him, though she had no proof to offer beyond her own careful memory of the numbers, and within a month, she found herself standing outside the parsonage door with a single trunk of belongings and $22 saved quietly over the years from her own small mending work, watching a new young minister's family begin unpacking crates into the home she had kept for 2 decades. She did not leave Millhaven, though several of her oldest friends gently suggested she might find an easier welcome starting fresh in Denver or one of the larger towns along the rail line, because leaving would have meant abandoning both her husband's grave and the persistent, nagging certainty that something in the chapel's old records did not add up. A certainty her father's exacting stonemason's instincts and her mother's devotion to honest record-keeping had trained into her from childhood. It was at the county courthouse, inquiring after a modest room to let, that she learned the old stone chapel on Widow's Ridge, abandoned a decade earlier when the congregation relocated to a larger, newer building in the center of town, was finally to be sold at auction that very week, the county having grown weary of the derelict structure sitting unclaimed and untaxed on its books. Adeline felt something shift in her chest at the news, some old, complicated pull toward the very building her father had raised stone by stone in her childhood, and those $17 represented the greater part of everything she now possessed in the world. She resolved, almost before she had fully reasoned through the wisdom of it, to bid on the chapel herself. The old chapel, when Adeline walked up to it the morning of the auction, stood exactly as forsaken as 10 years of neglect could make it, its stone walls, thanks to her father's craftsmanship, still solid and true despite the passing seasons, but its roof sagging badly where shingles had rotted through, its windows shattered or boarded, its small bell tower leaning at a faint but unmistakable angle that worried the county assessor enough that he had recommended, in his notes, that the structure likely wanted demolition rather than sale. When the auctioneer opened bidding at the courthouse steps that afternoon, the assembled crowd, which included Harmon Pruitt himself standing near the back with an expression of faint, unreadable amusement, offered nothing beyond a few muttered jokes about ghosts and ruin, until Adeline raised her hand and offered $17, a sum so modest the auctioneer nearly laughed aloud before catching himself and gaveling the sale, remarking that he supposed the widow Foss had earned the right to a piece of her husband's old ministry however she wished to spend it. Several onlookers murmured, not unkindly, that grief had clearly gotten the better of her judgment, that she had spent nearly everything she had left on a building likely to collapse before the next hard snow, and Adeline, walking away with the deed folded carefully into her coat pocket, could not entirely dismiss their concern, though something in her chest, some old inherited certainty about stone and story both, told her the chapel was not yet finished with its purpose. She spent her first days at the chapel simply making its smallest corner habitable, clearing the vestry room behind the old pulpit of a decade's accumulated dust and nesting birds, patching the worst of the roof above that single room with scavenged shingles, and building small, careful fires in a stove that had somehow survived the years intact. It was on her 5th day, while she was inspecting the base of the leaning bell tower to judge what repairs, if any, might save it from collapse, running her hands along the stone the way her father had taught her to test for hidden faults, that her fingers found, in the tower's inner wall behind a section of loose masonry, a narrow cavity that had clearly been deliberately built into the structure itself, sealed behind a stone that fit its neighbors so precisely that only someone trained, as Adeline had been from childhood, to notice the subtle irregularity of a mortar line freshly troweled over old work would ever have found it at all. Adeline worked that stone loose with the same patient care her father had shown 3 decades before laying it, and found, tucked into the cavity behind it, a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas containing a thick, leather-bound journal, a smaller ledger book, and a short stack of letters tied with twine gone brittle with age. She carried the bundle down to the vestry room and sat with it by firelight, unwrapping the canvas with hands that trembled slightly from cold and anticipation both, and found, upon opening the journal, that its pages were filled with the unmistakable hand of Elijah Thorne, the very circuit preacher who had overseen the chapel's construction and whose mysterious departure from Millhaven had never been fully explained to Adeline's satisfaction even as a child. The journal was not, she quickly realized, an ordinary diary but something closer to an unfinished memoir, an account Thorne had clearly intended to complete and share publicly, describing in careful, anguished detail the founding subscription he had raised from Millhaven's earliest families, a fund meant to build not only the chapel itself, but a proper schoolhouse and modest hospital for the growing mining town, a fund that had been entrusted, at the town council's insistence, to the safekeeping of the settlement's first banker, a shrewd and ambitious man named Josiah Pruitt. Adeline read through the night, understanding with growing dismay that Josiah Pruitt, grandfather to the very Harmon Pruitt who had so recently turned her out of the parsonage, had quietly embezzled the greater portion of that founding subscription over several years, falsifying withdrawal records to disguise the theft, and that when Elijah Thorne finally discovered the discrepancy and confronted him privately, Josiah had moved swiftly to protect himself, spreading quiet accusations among the town council that it was Thorne himself who had misappropriated the missing funds, a false charge that, lacking any surviving documentation to disprove it at the time, had driven the beloved young preacher out of Millhaven in disgrace rather than face a scandal he could not adequately defend. Thorne's journal, evidently begun in the bitter months following his departure and intended, it seemed from its unfinished final pages, to be sent eventually to a sympathetic newspaper or territorial authority once he had gathered sufficient corroborating evidence, ended abruptly mid-sentence, the remaining pages blank, suggesting either that he had run out of time, courage, or life itself before completing the account he clearly meant the world to someday read. The journal described, in painful detail, Adeline had never once heard spoken aloud in all her years growing up in Millhaven, the particular hope Elijah Thorne had carried west with him as a young circuit preacher, a conviction that a mining town built on the shifting fortunes of silver and hard luck needed, more than any pulpit, a permanent schoolhouse where its children might learn letters regardless of whether their fathers struck a rich vein or a barren one, and a small hospital where the injuries so common to that dangerous work might be tended by more than a traveling doctor's occasional visit. He had gone door to door himself, the journal recorded, gathering pledges from families who could ill afford them, families like Adeline's own, and it had clearly cost him something private and painful to write, decades later, of watching that carefully gathered trust dissolve into accusation and disgrace through no fault of his own. Adeline recognized, reading those pages, more than a few names still living in Millhaven, elderly now, whose grandparents' modest pledges had helped build the very walls she now sat within, and she understood that the theft Josiah Pruitt had committed had not merely stolen coin, but had stolen, from an entire generation of founding families, the tangible proof of their own sacrifice. Adeline sat with that unfinished story for the better part of a week, turning over in her mind both the injustice done to Elijah Thorne and the strange, aching realization that the very fund she had puzzled over for years in Nathaniel's old ledgers, the founding subscription Harmon Pruitt had so casually dismissed as long since absorbed into general expenses, was in fact the same theft his own grandfather had committed nearly 40 years before, a theft the Pruitt family had quietly built its considerable Millhaven fortune upon in the decades since. She understood, with the same careful instinct her father had brought to reading stone and her mother to reading a ledger, that she was holding something far larger than one wronged preacher's private grievance, that she held proof of a fraud that had shaped the entire trajectory of the town, denying Millhaven the schoolhouse and hospital its founding families had sacrificed to fund, and quietly enriching a single family across 2 generations at the expense of the whole community's trust. She did not act rashly, understanding from painful recent experience with Harmon Pruitt's smooth dismissals that an old journal alone, however damning, would carry little weight against a family of his continued standing and influence in Millhaven. And so through the following weeks, even as she continued the slow work of making the chapel livable and began, out of simple necessity, taking and mending work from families still willing to trust her custom, Adeline spent her evenings cross-referencing Elijah Thorne's account against Nathaniel's old church ledgers, which she still possessed among her own belongings, tracing the precise gap in the founding subscription's recorded balance against the exact years Thorne's journal described the theft occurring. She wrote as well to the Territorial Banking Commission in Denver, requesting whatever historical records might survive from the long-defunct Millhaven Miners Trust, the small bank Josiah Pruitt had once operated before selling its assets and reinventing himself as a respectable dry goods merchant in his later years, a transition Adeline now understood with considerably less innocent an interpretation than she once might have offered. It was Otis Greeley, an elderly former bank clerk who had worked briefly under Josiah Pruitt decades before and now lived in quiet retirement on the edge of town, who first grew curious about Adeline's careful questions regarding the old miners' trust, and it was Otis, entirely without malicious intent, who mentioned to a mutual acquaintance that the widow Foss seemed to be researching the bank's old history, a mention that reached Harmon Pruitt within days, as such things inevitably did in a town the size of Millhaven. Pruitt arrived at the chapel himself on a cold, blustery afternoon, dressed in his usual fine dark coat, his manner carrying an edge of impatience he did not fully manage to disguise beneath his customary courtesy, urging Adeline plainly to abandon whatever notion had taken hold of her regarding old church records and old rumors, reminding her that a widow alone, dependent on the goodwill of Millhaven's more established families for whatever small custom sustained her, would do far better to accept her circumstances quietly than to go stirring up matters long since settled and forgotten. Adeline thanked him for his concern with the same measured composure she had shown him at the council meeting months before, and said nothing of what she had actually found in the bell tower, though she noted, with her mother's trained attention to a person's smallest tells, the unmistakable flicker of genuine unease behind Pruitt's practiced calm, an unease that told her far more plainly than any words could have exactly how much he understood might be at stake. The wider town, when whispers eventually spread that the widow at the old chapel had been asking pointed questions about the long-defunct Miners' Trust and its connection to the Pruitt family's fortune, proved slow and reluctant to take her seriously, since Harmon Pruitt remained, whatever Adeline's private misgivings, a generous benefactor of the new church, a funder of the town's small library, and a man whose dry goods credit sustained half the households in Millhaven through lean seasons. It seemed, to most of the town, far more plausible that grief had unsettled a lonely widow's judgment than that their respected deacon's family fortune rested upon a fraud committed against the very founding families who had trusted Josiah Pruitt with their sacrifice. Several of Adeline's old acquaintances grew quietly distant in her company, uncertain how to regard a woman seemingly intent on dredging up scandal against a family whose goodwill they depended upon, and the town's small newspaper, when Adeline cautiously approached its editor with a portion of what she had found, declined to print anything. Without considerably more corroborating proof than one old, unfinished journal could apparently provide. Pruitt himself, growing bolder as no public evidence emerged to trouble him further, let it be known through a mutual acquaintance that continued mending work from Millhaven's better families might prove harder for the widow Foss to secure should her strange preoccupations continue, a threat Adeline recognized immediately for the quiet, deliberate cruelty it was meant to convey. One more link in a chain clearly intended to starve her into silence before she could ever assemble proof sufficient to challenge him. It was not only doubt and quiet threat that Adeline encountered in those difficult weeks, for a small handful of Millhaven's oldest residents, once they understood what she was quietly investigating, began to offer their own fragments of memory in support of her search, among them a widow named Cora Bennett, whose own grandmother had been one of the original subscribers to Thorne's founding fund and who recalled, from childhood, her grandmother's bitter insistence that the beloved young preacher had been wronged, an insistence the family had long since stopped repeating aloud for fear of stirring trouble with the town's most prominent family. Cora's willingness to speak, however quietly, gave Adeline the first sense since her husband's death that she was not entirely alone in Millhaven, and though Cora's memories alone could not prove anything a court would recognize, they steadied Adeline's resolve through the long, uncertain weeks of waiting for the Territorial Archive to answer her inquiries. What finally shifted the balance in Adeline's favor arrived from an unexpected quarter entirely, a reply to her inquiry at the Territorial Banking Commission in Denver, which, after some months of searching through poorly preserved archives, produced surviving deposit and withdrawal ledgers from the old Millhaven Miners' Trust covering precisely the years Elijah Thorne's journal described, ledgers that, when Adeline carefully compared them against Nathaniel's old church records and Thorne's own careful account, revealed an unmistakable pattern of falsified withdrawals bearing Josiah Pruitt's own signature. Withdrawals that matched, almost to the dollar, the exact sum missing from the chapel's founding subscription. Adeline carried this evidence, along with Thorne's unfinished journal and the smaller ledger found alongside it, not to Harmon Pruitt, but to Judge Corwin Ashby, the circuit judge who presided over the county's more complex civil matters and who, as it happened, had studied under Elijah Thorne's own successor decades before and retained a particular respect for the founding preacher's memory. Judge Ashby, a careful and unhurried man, spent the better part of a month examining the assembled documents, corresponding with the Territorial Archive to verify their authenticity, before informing Adeline that the evidence was substantial enough to warrant a formal public inquiry into the old miner's trust and its historical connection to the present Pruitt family fortune. The inquiry, held in Millhaven's newer, larger church because it alone could accommodate the crowd that gathered once word spread through the whole county, unfolded over the better part of 2 days, and Harmon Pruitt arrived composed and dismissive, prepared to characterize the entire matter as a grieving widow's confused obsession with ancient, unverifiable rumors, an interpretation that grew steadily harder to sustain as Judge Ashby methodically presented the falsified bank ledgers, Elijah Thorne's own anguished account, and the precise, undeniable correspondence between the two. When Judge Ashby read aloud the final unfinished pages of Thorne's journal, the account breaking off mid-sentence as though the old preacher had simply run out of time to finish defending his own name, a heavy stillness settled over that crowded sanctuary, the particular stillness of an entire community realizing that a beloved man's public disgrace decades before had been built entirely on a lie, and that the family whose fortune and standing they had so long respected had profited quietly from that same lie for 2 generations. Judge Ashby ruled that while Josiah Pruitt could not be prosecuted for a fraud committed some 4 decades earlier, the historical record would be formally corrected to clear Elijah Thorne's name of any wrongdoing, and that the Pruitt family's considerable holdings, demonstrably built in significant part upon the embezzled founding subscription, were subject to a formal claim by the Church Council for restitution equivalent to the original stolen fund, adjusted fairly for the passing decades. Adeline could have pressed, in the aftermath of that ruling, for whatever personal compensation the law might have allowed her as the one who had uncovered the fraud, and there were those in Millhaven who urged her plainly to claim exactly that reward for herself after everything she had endured. Instead, standing before the gathered town in the same plain gray dress she had worn to bid $17 on a crumbling chapel months before, Adeline asked only that the restitution be used precisely as Elijah Thorne had originally intended the founding subscription to be used, to build, at long last, the schoolhouse and small hospital the town's earliest families had sacrificed to fund, with the old stone chapel on Widow's Ridge restored and preserved as a public memorial to Thorne's memory and to the honest sacrifice of every founding family whose trust had been so quietly betrayed. It was, the town would say for years afterward, a request that revealed more about her character than any sermon could have managed, and it was that quiet, deliberate generosity, more than the scandal itself, that finally turned Millhaven's wary hesitation into something like genuine reverence. In the months that followed, the old chapel was restored not by Adeline's labor alone, but by a town suddenly eager to make amends for its earlier doubt. Its walls repointed by masons who had once trained under Adeline's own father, its leaning bell tower straightened, and its bell, silent for a decade, rung once more to mark the laying of the schoolhouse's first cornerstone on the very ground Elijah Thorne had originally set aside for that purpose. Cora Bennett, whose grandmother's long-ago pledge had helped found the very fund Josiah Pruitt stole, stood beside Adeline at that cornerstone ceremony, and it was Cora who suggested, gently, that the new schoolhouse bear a small engraved plaque listing the names of every founding family whose sacrifice had finally borne fruit 2 generations later, a suggestion Adeline embraced readily, understanding better than most how much quiet dignity there was in simply having one's name remembered. Rightly at last, the hospital, smaller and slower to rise than the schoolhouse, broke ground the following spring on a parcel of land donated by the county once word of the inquiry's outcome spread beyond Millhaven's borders, and Adeline made a point of visiting its construction regularly, watching the careful, patient work of masons and carpenters with the same attentive eye her father had once trained on her, satisfied to see a promise made decades before finally taking on the shape Elijah Thorne had always intended it to hold. Harmon Pruitt, stripped of a considerable portion of the fortune his family had quietly built on his grandfather's theft, remained in Millhaven only a short while longer before selling his dry goods business and departing the territory altogether, and though some in town felt the reckoning had come too gently for a fraud spanning 2 generations, Adeline, who had learned patience from a father who never rushed a stone and a mother who understood that an honest story eventually finds its way into the light, believed that watching a proud family lose, within living memory, the very respectability they had spent decades quietly stealing was its own form of justice, delivered at last in its proper season. It is worth remembering, as this story draws toward its close, that Adeline Foss stood outside her own parsonage with a single trunk and $22, cast out by a council that believed a widow without ordination or children held no further claim to the life she had spent 2 decades faithfully serving. She spent 17 of those dollars on a crumbling chapel the entire town had long since written off as beyond saving, because some deep, inherited instinct, passed down from a father who trusted stone and a mother who trusted honest words, told her that very little in this world is truly finished until its story has been properly told. Inside that leaning bell tower waited not a fortune meant for her alone, but an unfinished account of injustice that, once completed by her own patient hand, restored a wronged man's name and gave an entire community back the schoolhouse and the honest history it had been denied for 2 generations. In choosing to finish what Elijah Thorne could not, Adeline proved that some stories, however long delayed, are never truly lost, only waiting for someone patient enough to find them and brave enough to see them through. She often said, in the years that followed, whenever a visitor to the chapel asked how she had first come to suspect the truth buried in that leaning bell tower, that she had simply done what her father taught her to do with any wall that seemed to lean without cause, which was to look closely at the mortar rather than assume the whole structure unsound, and what her mother taught her to do with any column of figures that failed to balance, which was to keep asking patient questions until the numbers finally agreed to tell the truth. It was, she would add, never any particular cleverness of her own that uncovered what Elijah Thorne had hidden, but simply a refusal to accept that a story left unfinished was the same as a story without an ending, and it was that refusal, more than any singular discovery, that she hoped Millhaven's children might carry forward from her own small part in the town's long history. Adeline Foss spent the remainder of her years at the restored chapel on Widow's Ridge, keeping its small library and its careful records exactly as she always had, respected at last not merely as a minister's widow, but as the woman who had given Millhaven back both its history and its conscience. And though she never again possessed great wealth, she wanted for nothing that truly mattered, surrounded by a town that had learned, through her patient unearthing of an old injustice, exactly what could be waiting, silent and unfinished, inside the places everyone else had already agreed to forget. As Adeline's story comes to an end, remember this. Sometimes the world calls something forgotten when it's simply waiting for the right person to believe in it again. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Share it with a friend, a family member, or someone who may need a reminder that hope doesn't always arrive quickly, but it does arrive for those who refuse to give up. Now, we'd love to hear your story. Have you ever held on to a dream everyone else abandoned? Have you ever returned to a place, a promise, or a person when everyone said it was too late? Or have you witnessed a miracle that only patience could reveal? Leave your answer in the comments below. We read your stories, and many of them inspire future videos for this community. Your experience could be exactly what another viewer needs to read today. And if you enjoy true stories of resilience, forgotten lives, hidden histories, and extraordinary second chances, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Every week we bring you deeply moving stories that remind us that courage isn't always loud, justice isn't always immediate, and hope is never truly lost. If you haven't already, give this video a like. It helps YouTube recommend these meaningful stories to more people, allowing voices like Adeline's to continue reaching hearts around the world. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Your time means more than you know, and your support keeps these stories alive. Until our paths cross again, take care of those you love. Never underestimate the power of quiet perseverance. And remember, some of life's greatest victories belong to those who simply refuse to walk away. We'll see you in the next story.